Everyone ignored the quiet, broken veteran, except her. When she gave him a warm meal and a seat in her empty diner, the town turned its back on her. But the very next morning, something happened that no one saw coming. The street outside her cafe filled with roaring engines, and the town learned a lesson it would never forget. In the fall of 2012, the small town of Redland, Wyoming, seemed to fade with the arriving cold. The air grew sharper, the skies grayer, and a quiet melancholy settled over the empty streets. Once anchored by a coal processing plant that provided steady employment, the town had begun to hollow out after the plant's permanent closure that summer. The economic pulse of Redland slowed to a faint throb. Storefronts stood abandoned with cracked windows and hand-painted "for sale" signs. Lawns grew untamed, sidewalks collected dry leaves, and the silence felt heavier with each passing week. At the center of the town, on a corner lot lined with dead grass and crumbling asphalt, stood an old gas station that had long been converted into a roadside diner. Its signage had faded from red to orange over the years, the paint peeling in strips like curled paper. It was called Joe's Place, though Joe himself had been gone for 5 years. His widow, Mary Jo Simmons, now 42, arrived every morning before sunrise to unlock the door and bring the cold metal kitchen to life. She wiped down the long window panes from the outside, always using the same worn towel folded neatly into quarters. Then she would arrange the menus on the sticky, laminated tables and drop the needle on an old Elvis Presley record spinning on a dusty turntable perched behind the counter. The music helped fill the space, though it couldn't disguise the emptiness. Joe's Place had once served as a meeting point for miners, truckers, and old-timers who talked politics over biscuits and gravy. But those voices had faded. Now the booths sat mostly empty, and the scent of fresh coffee floated through a quiet too deep for comfort. Mary could still recall the laughter that once echoed between the walls, her husband's booming voice greeting familiar faces as he flipped pancakes behind the grill. That sound had long since gone, swallowed by time and loss. She had inherited more than the cafe. She had inherited a life interrupted. Since the accident, Mary never once considered leaving Redland. Her entire story was rooted here. Her childhood, her parents' graves in the local cemetery, her first date with Joe, and the dream they built together inside those grease-streaked walls. After Joe's death, the diner became her anchor, something to pour her grief into, something to maintain even when the town began to forget itself. But by 2012, the strain was visible. The roof leaked above the pantry. The coffee machine sputtered more than it brewed. The heating vents coughed dust every time she turned the dial. Each month brought more overdue notices, and the envelopes piled up in a drawer she rarely opened. Still, Mary kept opening the doors. She still kept the lights on. She still stood behind the counter with a practiced smile, waiting, always waiting, for someone to walk in and bring back the warmth. At night, she would sit by the small window in her office, counting quarters and faded bills, trying to stretch every cent. There was no more staff. She hadn't been able to afford help in over a year. She cooked, served, cleaned, and balanced the books herself. Some nights she whispered her worries into the silence, asking questions only she could hear. How much longer she could keep this up, how much more she could give. Outside, the wind would whistle across the plains, shaking the rusted signs and fluttering forgotten flyers nailed to telephone poles. Redland was fading, and with each passing week, it seemed as though Mary's light was fading with it. Yet every morning she came back, turned the key in the lock, and started the day again. Because that's what Joe would have done. Because that's what home meant, even when nobody was watching, even when hope felt thin. On a damp October evening, with a fine drizzle hanging in the air like a veil, an old, weather-stained pickup truck rolled quietly into the gravel lot beside Joe's Place. The headlights cut through the mist, casting a ghostly glow on the windows before flicking off. The truck was rusty in patches, the kind that spoke of years and miles, with a small trailer hitched to the back that sagged slightly on one side. From the driver's side stepped a tall, slightly stooped man in a soaked canvas jacket and a faded ball cap pulled low over his brow. The moment he stepped out, the cold seemed to lean harder against the cafe windows, as if the weather had followed him in. Mary, standing behind the counter with a towel in hand, noticed him before he even entered. His boots were torn near the soles, the laces mismatched. His walk was deliberate, slow, but not aimless. He pushed open the glass door and paused for a second, eyes adjusting to the warm light and scent of coffee and old grease. Without speaking, he moved to the farthest booth in the corner and lowered himself onto the cracked leather bench with a sigh too quiet for anyone else to hear. There were only two other patrons that night, older men from a nearby farm who came every Thursday for pot roast. They both turned their heads when the stranger entered, their conversation halted mid-sentence. One sipped his coffee while watching the man over the rim of his cup, the other pretending to read a menu he'd memorized a decade ago. Neither spoke. The silence grew a little heavier, as it often did in places where everyone thought they knew everyone. The man placed a small order, paid in crumpled bills with coins wrapped in a paper napkin, and ate without rush or distraction. His movements were careful, almost cautious, as though testing the space around him. When he stood to leave, Mary noticed the glint of metal under his collar. Hanging from a thin cord around his neck was a dog tag, dulled by time, but unmistakable. He pulled his jacket tighter as he stepped outside into the drizzle. For a moment he lingered near the doorway, not yet returning to the cab of his truck, just staring off into the dim outlines of the town. Then, without hurry, he climbed back into the pickup and drove off into the rain. The next morning, the truck returned. This time he parked further back near the edge of the lot and stayed longer. In the evening, he returned again. For 3 days in a row, the same quiet routine unfolded. He came in around dusk, always alone, always choosing the same seat. He ordered modest meals, never anything complicated. He left cash and nothing else. Never asked questions. Never gave more than was required. He watched the window mostly, as if waiting for something that never came. Mary couldn't explain what it was that struck her about him. It wasn't his face, which was half hidden beneath stubble and the shade of his cap. It wasn't the clothes, worn and shapeless. It was something beneath all that, something heavy that sat on his shoulders like invisible weight, a kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but pressure. He carried himself like a man used to discomfort, used to silence, maybe even used to being misunderstood. By the end of the week, whispers had started to travel through the town. Redland was small, and word moved quickly. Someone had seen the truck parked near the edge of the highway, the man sleeping in it most nights. Others speculated about his background. Was he on the run? A former inmate? Some thought he might be dealing drugs or worse. People always seemed to assume the worst of anyone who didn't explain themselves. The local hardware store clerk mentioned him to a customer. The librarian asked if Mary felt safe. There was no malice in their questions, just fear of the unknown. Mary didn't respond to the rumors. She continued to serve him like anyone else. But inside, she found herself watching him too, watching not out of suspicion, but out of a quiet concern she didn't fully understand. There was something deeply human about his solitude, something raw, something broken, and still, every night he came back. On the third evening of his quiet visits, the door to Joe's place opened not to the familiar creak of a regular, but to the heavy footsteps of two uniformed officers. The taller of the two, Sergeant Brooks, had known Mary since childhood. His presence brought a different kind of silence to the diner, a heavier, expectant pause that made the air feel suddenly still. Without saying a word to her, the officers made their way toward the back booth where the drifter sat, quietly eating his meal with his head slightly bowed. Their approach was slow and deliberate. They didn't sit. They stood over him like shadows, casting a quiet authority that filled the room. The older men at the front booth pretended not to notice, but their eyes flicked toward the scene every few seconds. The officers asked questions, where he was from, where he was going, why he was here. The man responded plainly, his voice low but steady. He said he was passing through Wyoming, heading to Colorado to see his brother. There was no stammer, no hesitation. Just facts, delivered without warmth. Still, that didn't seem enough. One of the officers requested identification. The man, without complaint, reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He handed them his ID and a folded military discharge document, both creased and weathered from time. Mary watched from behind the counter, her hands frozen on a dish rag, her breath caught halfway between concern and anger. She couldn't hear the words, but she read the scene. There was no tension in the man's movements, no sign of guilt, only resignation. The documents were returned. There was nothing to hold him for. No warrants, no red flags, just a name and a past. As they turned to leave, Sergeant Brooks made a passing remark, quiet enough to seem casual, loud enough to sting. A comment about people who didn't belong, about what kind of company a place like Joe's place should keep. The words hung in the air like smoke. No one responded. No one needed to. The message was received. The following day, Mary opened the café to silence. No customers, no regulars. Even the old farmers skipped their usual table. Around noon, she noticed something scrawled in red marker across the bottom half of the front window. The letters were uneven, jagged, written in haste. "Go back to where you came from." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The ink bled slightly in the morning dew. Mary stood for a long moment before fetching a rag and a bottle of cleaner. She scrubbed it off herself, without calling the police, without saying a word. That night, the man returned. He walked in with the same quiet steps, chose the same booth. There was no hesitation, no reaction to the window that only hours before bore the message meant for him. Mary brought him his usual meal. This time, she didn't take his money. She set the plate down and walked away. He didn't argue. He didn't thank her. That moment was not about charity. It was about something else entirely, something unspoken and deeply necessary. Later in the evening, after the diner had emptied, Mary poured a second cup of coffee and walked back to his table. She sat across from him, not as a business owner or a hostess, but as a person in need of understanding another. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, and the window fogged gently behind them. He told her his name was Garrett Dixon, a former soldier, a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. He spoke quietly, without dramatics, offering his story like someone placing broken pieces on a table, not asking her to fix them, just letting them be seen. He had lost his daughter only a few months earlier to an overdose. She had been in and out of rehab for years. When she died, something in him broke permanently. He sold their house, left behind the photos, the memories, the birthdays, took to the road with no real destination, just the hum of tires and the silence between towns. He said he wasn't running exactly. He just couldn't stand still. Not yet. Mary listened, not with pity but with recognition. She understood the kind of loss that hollows you from the inside out, the kind that lingers in quiet spaces and turns even comfort into a burden. She didn't interrupt him, didn't offer cliches or soft encouragements. She simply sat there while he spoke, holding space in a world that had stopped giving him any. For the first time since he arrived, Garrett didn't look out the window as he finished his coffee. He looked across the table, and though he said nothing else, something between them had shifted, not into friendship, not yet, but into something deeper than strangers. A few days after the encounter with the police, a small article appeared in the Redland Gazette, buried between a weather update and a piece about the local high school's fall festival. It was written in vague language, never naming names, but the subtext was unmistakable. It warned readers to be cautious of a drifter with military ties who had been seen frequenting local establishments, subtly suggesting that his presence might be unsettling to other patrons. It didn't say he was dangerous, but it didn't have to. In a town like Redland, ambiguity could be sharper than fact. The fallout was swift and quiet. Customers stopped coming. Tables that once saw regular morning visitors remained untouched. The booths by the windows sat vacant, their salt shakers full and undisturbed. Mary stopped brewing full pots of coffee. There was no need. Deliveries from her usual suppliers began arriving later than scheduled, or sometimes not at all. One of the local dairy farmers, a man she'd done business with for over a decade, called to say he would no longer be bringing milk. He mumbled something about values and reputation before hanging up. At the grocery store, people looked past her. In the post office, conversations hushed when she entered. Familiar faces that once greeted her with nods or small talk now found reasons to look away. She became a fixture of discomfort, a woman who had crossed an invisible line, not because she had broken any laws, but because she had offered a warm meal to someone the town had quietly decided did not belong. Despite it all, Mary kept the cafe running. Every evening, she flipped on the neon open sign and brewed coffee that no one came to drink. She wiped the tables, checked inventory she barely needed, and stood behind the counter, watching headlights pass on the main road like distant promises that never turned into her lot. Some nights, she swept the same corner twice just to hear the sound of the broom. The café, once a place of chatter and movement, now echoed with the soft creaks of time. Garrett still came. Each evening around the same time, the old pickup pulled into the lot. He entered without fanfare, claimed his usual seat, and sat in silence unless invited to speak. Sometimes he shared pieces of himself, a memory of his daughter's laugh, a nightmare that woke him in the middle of the night, a moment in the desert that never left him. Other times he simply sat with his hands wrapped around a cup, staring at the window as if searching for something in the reflections. Mary never pressed him. She had learned that healing didn't follow a straight path, and sometimes the greatest kindness was simply showing up. One night, as the wind howled through the streets and the windows rattled in their frames, Garrett spoke more than usual. His words came slowly, cautiously, as though he had rehearsed them in his head for hours. He admitted that he no longer knew what kept him going, that since his daughter's death, time had become a strange, empty thing. He confessed he hadn't spoken to his brother in years, hadn't slept a full night in longer than he could remember, and didn't know what he was looking for on the road. Mary listened, her expression unreadable but steady. In Garrett, she saw not a threat, not a burden, but a man unmoored in a country that had used him and then forgotten him. A man carrying too much grief for one body to hold. In the eyes of the town, he was a stranger, maybe even a problem. But to her, he had become a mirror, reflecting a kind of loneliness she understood all too well. As she cleaned up that night, turning chairs onto tables and dimming the lights, Mary stood in the middle of the empty cafe and realized something simple but unshakable. She was no longer afraid of losing customers. She was afraid of becoming like the rest of the town, silent, detached, judgmental by default. Indifference, she thought, was colder than isolation, and if she had to choose between running a dying cafe with her dignity or keeping it alive by turning away a man in need, the choice wasn't really a choice at all. She locked the front door, turned off the sign, and looked back once more at the booth in the corner. It was still warm from where Garrett had been sitting. For now, that was enough. One chilly morning, just after sunrise had washed the sky in pale gold, a man appeared at the entrance to Joe's place. He was older, perhaps in his early 60s, dressed in a neatly pressed jacket and worn leather shoes. His silver hair was combed back, and a short, well-kept beard framed his tired face. He knocked gently before stepping inside, the bell above the door giving a soft jingle that broke the stillness. Mary looked up from the counter, surprised not only by the unfamiliar face, but by the quiet authority the man carried with him. He introduced himself as James Dixon, Garrett's older brother. His voice was calm, deliberate, and carried a weight of history that was immediately felt. He explained that a friend of his from a nearby town had sent him a link to a local news website. There, among obituaries and community bulletins, was a photograph of Mary's diner, and a blurry image of Garrett standing at the window, half-turned, unaware he was being captured. The accompanying story was light on facts but filled with emotion, about a woman running a diner in a shrinking town and a stranger with a haunted past who kept returning each night. James said that Garrett had drifted away from the family years ago. After returning from Afghanistan, he had changed, became quieter, distant, more prone to disappearing for long stretches. When his daughter died, that distance became a wall no one could reach through. The family had tried, but Garrett had shut them out completely. So when James heard that someone had shown his brother kindness, without judgment or conditions, he had felt compelled to come. He thanked Mary not with formality, but with something deeper, a quiet recognition of what it meant to extend a hand when the rest of the world had looked away. He offered her money, resources, anything that might help keep the place open. Mary, polite but firm, declined. She hadn't helped Garrett for praise or compensation. Her reasons were personal, rooted in loss and a refusal to let the world decide who deserved compassion. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, a car pulled into the lot outside Joe's place. Then another. Then a third. By noon, the line of vehicles stretched down the block. Families with children, men on motorcycles, and aging veterans in pickup trucks stepped out onto the pavement. One man, wrapped in a thick jacket and seated in a wheelchair, was carefully lifted to the curb by his companions. Others carried trays of baked goods, toolboxes, and armfuls of supplies. They came in quietly, respectfully, one group at a time. Orders were placed, food served, and payment always came with generous tips. Some customers lingered after their meals, not wanting to leave. The mood in the diner was light but reverent, as though the walls themselves had remembered what it felt like to be alive with purpose. Mary moved from table to table in a blur, not sure how or why this was happening, until one man leaned forward across the counter and explained in a low voice that they were part of a veteran support network. Word had spread about her stand, her refusal to turn away someone who had already been turned away too many times. Within an hour, the cafe was full. Outside, pedestrians began to gather, drawn by the unusual bustle. Children pressed their faces to the windows. Teenagers took photos and whispered among themselves. Garrett's name passed from person to person like a memory rediscovered. One man raised a glass in his honor. Another stood beside Mary and quietly offered to fix the leaking roof, saying he had seen the stains above the kitchen during his meal. More stories came. A woman from Utah said she had lost her husband to PTSD and had driven 2 hours just to be part of the moment. A retired soldier from Montana said he knew Garrett from deployment and hadn't heard his name in over a decade. An elderly couple brought a bag of fresh vegetables from their farm. A mechanic promised to service the cafe's delivery van for free. Someone else slipped an envelope into the tip jar containing a handwritten note and a folded American flag. Online, the story was gaining traction. Photos of the diner began to circulate. Its chipped paint, the glowing neon sign, the hand-lettered menu board. People began sharing posts about kindness in unexpected places. Some called it a movement. Others just called it justice. Messages flooded Mary's inbox from strangers across the country who said they had served or loved someone who had. They thanked her, not only for what she had done for Garrett, but for reminding others that humanity wasn't something you had to earn. As the day turned to evening and the last rays of sun caught the dust in the diner's windows, Mary stepped outside. The street was still buzzing with people, but the atmosphere had changed. The judgment and whispers that once clung to her cafe had been replaced by laughter, music from motorcycle radios, and the faint smell of grilled burgers from someone's portable setup in the parking lot. In the center of it all, Garrett stood among a small group of veterans. He looked different, still quiet, still burdened, but somehow more anchored. He wasn't the only one anymore. He wasn't alone. 2 weeks had passed since the flood of strangers transformed Joe's place from a forgotten roadside diner into something that felt like the center of a quiet revival. The buzz had softened, but the echoes remained. Mary noticed it in the subtle shifts around her. Locals who had once turned away now returned, cautiously at first, as though unsure how to re-enter a place they had so quickly abandoned. They came for coffee, for pie, for conversation, but also for something harder to name, a sense of accountability, perhaps, or a need to belong again. At first, their visits were brief, heads lowered, words few, but over time, the silences turned into questions, the questions into stories, and the stories into shared laughter. Some offered hesitant apologies for their absence, for their silence. Mary didn't demand them, didn't expect them. She simply served each person the same way she always had, with quiet steadiness and a warmth that asked nothing in return. Redland had not changed overnight, but something within it had shifted. The town, so quick to judge, had begun to listen. Garrett was still there. But he was no longer just the quiet figure in the corner booth. He moved more freely now, with a subtle confidence that came from repetition and routine. He helped Mary in the mornings, prepping the kitchen, repairing the failing refrigerator with tools he kept in the back of his truck. On busy days, he carried crates from the storeroom and wiped down counters without being asked. His presence, once the subject of suspicion, had become familiar, comforting, even necessary. He had started speaking more, too, not just to Mary, but to the veterans who continued to visit the cafe. Some came alone, others in groups. They found Garrett with quiet recognition in their eyes, a shared understanding of what couldn't be explained to others. They sat together at tables, not always talking about the past, but never needing to avoid it either. He listened to them, offered advice when asked, and slowly began to reclaim pieces of himself that had long been left behind. One afternoon, Mary received a letter in the mail bearing the seal of the state of Wyoming. Inside was a formal certificate signed by the governor, recognizing her for her outstanding contribution to the dignity and recognition of American veterans. Along with it came a short letter of thanks and an invitation to a public ceremony, which she politely declined. Instead, she framed the certificate and hung it on the café wall next to an old photograph of her late husband in his apron, smiling with a spatula in hand. Beneath it, she pinned a handmade wooden plaque Garrett had carved himself. It read, "Welcome, always." A month later, Garrett left. There was no fanfare, no final breakfast or goodbye party, just a quiet morning, the smell of coffee, and a folded note left on the counter beneath his usual cup. In it, he wrote that he was ready to keep moving, not to escape, but to begin again. He said he had not found a shelter in Redland, but a reminder of who he had been, of who he could still become, a reminder that the world wasn't always as cold as it seemed, and at the end, in shaky handwriting, he thanked Mary for the light in her window. She kept the note in the cash drawer, tucked beside a faded photograph of herself and Joe taken the summer they opened the diner. Now, each evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the shadows stretched long across the empty highway, Mary still turned on the neon sign and lit the corner lamp by the window. The ritual remained unchanged. The gesture no longer felt like a call into the void, but like the keeping of a promise. A promise that someone, somewhere, would see it. Joe's place wasn't just open for business. It was open for memory, for healing, for the lost and the returning. And though Garrett had gone, his presence lingered in the details, in the steady hum of the repaired fridge, in the smoothed wood of the plaque on the wall, in the stories veterans told over coffee. Mary stood behind the counter each night with the same quiet resolve, no longer alone, no longer waiting for a miracle. Because the miracle had come and gone, and in its place, something even better had taken root. A home. One with walls, yes, but more importantly, one that lived in the hearts of those who had stepped inside and left just a little bit changed.